Hello there, and welcome to Book Talks with Keith. I'm your host, author J. Keith Brown, and I'm so glad that you are finding this podcast. And it's a relatively new podcast. I've got another one that's been on for years, but this one is relatively new. Thank you, my dear listener, for taking, or viewer, if you're on YouTube, for taking the time and the risk to listen or watch this podcast. I think it serves a purpose because it shares all about new authors or authors that have been around a while, but just want to share their work with more people. So, with that said, today I've got another fantastic author that I want to welcome to the podcast, and his name is Dan Klefstad. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Hey Keith, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
It's my pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for doing this. And one of the things, Dan, I always tell people when they come on to my podcast is I think it's really important for people to get a chance to know you as a person. And I think probably even more so as a reader. I know for myself, when I know something about the author and who they are, a little bit about their life, even what their favorite food is, perhaps it just makes me buy into their work maybe just a little bit more. So why don't you share with the listener or viewer a little bit about Dan today?
Well, I just moved recently to Louisville after working for 30 years in public radio. I
Wow.
was the morning edition host and newscaster for NPR station WNIJ, based in DeKalb, Illinois. We covered all of northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. And last spring, my wife and I moved down here after I retired, and I'm been very excited to meet new readers in this area, also to hook up with bookstore owners and do interviews like this one here.
Yeah. Well, that's really cool. My first full-time job was in radio, so I can relate to you a little bit. That's great.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I didn't make it a career, Dan, so I'm happy for you that you did because I know what a joy it was to do. Um, so I know that one of the things that makes I always say the difference between a writer and an author, a writer writes, an author finishes. But with you, I would really like to know what your inspiration was, to go from radio. I know you had to do some writing and all that work, I am sure, but what made you want to go from that to actually writing books?
Well, I actually have twin answers to this question.
Okay.
One, I've been writing fiction ever since I was 16. That's when I wrote a spy novel that was absolutely terrible, but I finished it. So that made me an author, as you noted. 200 pages of typed double spaced, and it was just awful. But my mother, who read it at the time, said, I think you've got something here. Keep at it. And over the years, I kept at it. But over the years, also, I realized I had to have a full time job to support myself. And
For
I kind
sure.
of fell into radio, and radio news is where I actually got another, I'll call it a master class in how to write. Um, you know, some of my favorite authors are journalists or were at one point in their lives, and that includes Hemingway, who was writing to fit into column inches in a newspaper. Well, what I was writing, with news copy, I'm trying to fit into minutes. I had a newscast at the top of the hour that was 2 minutes 40 seconds, and another at the bottom of the hour that was 2 minutes 30 seconds. And so I had to really be careful about how many words I use and never to waste a single word. So that just taught me how to focus on a very simple simple sentence structure, subject, verb, object, and I got into that habit for a long time. Now, when writing literature, I was able to take this bare bones approach that I was using and add layers to it after a while, and that is but I found that just starting with the bare basics in sentence structure would prove to be the perfect foundation for writing literature.
And that is a big shift because, especially if you write fiction, because it becomes so, picturesque in its reading. And when you're working in journalism, working in news, as you said, that's hard hitting, like you said, very straight to the point. And I remember recording those 30-second commercials back in the day. It couldn't be 32 seconds. It could only be 30 seconds. So
Exactly.
I know that had to be a shift for you. Did you fall right into that, or did it take a little bit of time to sort of get there, do you think?
You mean to become proficient at that kind of writing?
Well, I mean, I just know that you were doing such strategic writing, with
Hmm.
your newscasting, and to shift that to a more literature style writing,
Right.
how was that? Did that take a length of time? Did it, flow naturally? Were you already doing both? How did that work out?
Yeah. I was doing both, but I think that that partly helped me because I had continued writing literature, but I noticed that my literature kept getting leaner and leaner and leaner the longer I worked in news. I did find that after a while, I was almost over editing my literature, and I needed to kind of step back and say, okay, this is not me telling you what happened today. I need to tell a much more involved story. And then I started layering on a little bit more and more, not too much, but experimenting with a little bit more description. I didn't want to interfere with the reader's imagination too much. So I didn't want to over describe things, but I wanted to leave just a little bit so you could form the picture in your own head. And I'm starting simple, bare bones, writing tight, as we used to say. That kind of helped me experiment and figure out how to tell a story by letting it blossom slowly.
Well, I think that's interesting. And, I know for myself, Dan, when I was going through graduate school and all when I was going on my education, I know I had one professor that kind of got on me a lot because for me, I guess I've always written more picturesque, even in my nonfiction, even in my thesis. I mean, I had to work hard at that because that did not come as natural to me as it did becoming the storyteller. So, and which I know the reason I get there is because I know that you've done what I've done, and that is to write fiction and nonfiction books. And there is a big difference, but it's kind of interesting to write those in parallel. And I think you've done that, right?
I have done that, and I've learned from both. I'm not saying it was always an easy switch
It is
back and forth.
not. It is
Yeah.
not.
But yeah, I liked the idea of having these two parallel approaches to my writing. To
Mhm.
okay, in this context, I'm going to give you the who, what, where, why, and when, and then over here, I'm going to maybe give you a character's exploration of what happened, and and try to get right in the voice of that character who may not speak like I do, and maybe even has well, completely different experiences than I have. And those experiences inform his storytelling, that sort of thing. I just really felt it useful to have both, but occasionally it would get confusing. But for the most part, well, here I am. I've made it, so to speak. So I'm on your show, so I must be doing it right.
I'm sure. I'm sure. So, let's talk a little bit more about your books because that's where I really want to spend most of our time today. Because that's truly what besides getting to know you a little bit personally, um, the reader wants to know a little bit about what you have written and why they should read it. So, let's talk a little bit about that.
Okay, yeah. So I spent many years in my youth watching movies and TV shows and reading books about vampires. For whatever reason, I always liked monsters. I always liked horror, but I just found vampires so much more relatable, I think, than other creatures of the night. You know,
Okay, I'm not
yeah.
sure how that works out, Dan, but I'll take your word for it. Okay. I don't know that I've ever related really to a vampire, but okay, whatever you
Well,
say.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that because they look a little bit or mostly like us, they're almost like us, or they're depicted that way,
Yes.
and they're always almost depicted as stronger than we humans are, sexier than we are, and they just go on living. So I found that eternal aspect of
Mhm,
fascinating as well.
mhm,
What would it be
mhm.
like to live 250, 350 years? Would I ever get bored? That sort of thing. And so this focus on time became kind of the real hook for me as I started experimenting with writing these vampire stories. And in 2017, I finally got one that was accepted by the literary journal Crack the Spine, their February edition. They published a short story called The Caretaker, which introduced the world to the vampire Fiona and her main human guardian, Daniel. And that short story comprises three early chapters of the book that came out a few years later, Fiona's Guardians.
Okay. So how many books are in so Fiona is she's the vampire?
That's correct.
Okay.
She
All
is
right.
a 250-year-old vampire who hires humans to manage her blood supply.
Wow, okay. Very interesting. And so how many books are there already in the
Fiona's Guardians is the first. I
okay.
am trying to finish the sequel. I've
Okay.
promised my publisher and many of my readers that the sequel will be out next October. I don't have a title yet for the sequel, but Fiona and Daniel will both be in this next book as well.
Is that October 24 or 25?
24.
Okay. All right. So October 24. Well, that's a lot. I know that some people listening to this, some readers are going like, well, wow, that's a long ways away. Not when you're an author.
That's right.
Those deadlines come a lot faster than you think. But so tell us, is there anything you can tell us any more about this book to make us just drool with anticipation about going to get it?
Yeah, actually. So Fiona's 250 years old. She hires humans, and her main human is Daniel, who arranges for her blood supply. If you like, I could read a 2-minute excerpt, which is right from the beginning of the book.
Please do.
Okay, most of this book is told from the standpoint of the humans who work for Fiona, but Fiona does address the reader directly on a handful of occasions, and including right at the beginning. Hello, mortal. I'm touched by your interest in those who work for me and those who used to. A handful truly deserve to be remembered in a book that never goes out of print. Their loyalty and talent are the reason I've existed for 2.5 centuries. A few, however, earned the painful and premature deaths detailed in these pages. For me, loyalty comes first and must be constant. That's not to say a partnership with me can't end in mutual agreement. It just never happened before. Still, I may allow my current guardian to retire. After serving longer than any other, he might well live his remaining years in a manner of his choosing. This would create an opportunity for another to earn his substantial salary and benefits. But a warning is in order. The work is as relentless and unsparing as my hunger, and everyone I employed has murdered at least once on my behalf. Not that this is the preferred option. There are other, less extreme ways to obtain blood for me, and Daniel built a robust network that could be handed off to a successor. He's in the car now, looking at his watch, wondering when we can go home to his decanter of scotch. From what I see, nothing in your cabinet would satisfy him, so rest assured I won't leave with any of your bottles. I see you've been reading job postings. Do not ask if I offer a retirement plan. In truth, I've never understood the concept. Each evening I awake knowing I'm the chief executive for extending my life, so ceasing work would amount to suicide. But this is what Daniel wants, and I owe him for that time he saved me from dying. It's in the book. My favorite chapters feature Agrippina, the one who created me. Driven by hunger, she brought me to the edge of death, but changed her mind when I started turning blue. She claimed she saw something worth preserving, an unselfish nature that disappeared when she opened a vein for me. Since that moment, the only feeling I've known, besides adoration for her, is a craving that never ceases. That is, until the instant I tasted regret, the perpetual pain of guilt at not being with her when our enemies reappeared. They're in here too, and so is my revenge. Go ahead, indulge your curiosity. When you finish reading, I'll visit again and make myself visible. You'll find me sitting in that chair over there, and we can talk about your future. Until then.
Wow, very powerful, Dan.
Thank
Very,
you.
very
Mm.
good. I enjoyed that, and I can honestly say I've never been a person to, you know, read a lot of sci-fi or anything like that. It's just not been a genre of choice for me. But I have to say that that was intriguing, and I
Oh,
really did
good.
enjoy that very much. In fact, I was sitting there while you were reading, I'm going like, man, this ought to be an audible book because
Yeah,
you were doing so
yes.
well with the reading.
I have been planning that. I have nothing yet in terms of uh, how I do feel like I'm going to have to, if I did this, I would have to hire a female actor who would play Fiona, and I could play Daniel and some of the main, and just read those lines. But I
Yeah,
am happy to say that this was adapted by an all professional acting company.
really.
Um, Artists Ensemble Theater uh, adapted they took 3 or 4 chapters from this book and turned it into a podcast. So you remember during the pandemic when during the pandemic the theater companies had to stop working
Sure.
basically. They
Oh
couldn't
yeah, yeah.
perform on stage anymore. So the more
Right.
savvy companies like AET um, started these theater of the mind podcasts, and some of them sound a lot like the old radio plays that we heard in the 1930s and 40s. So they got together with a studio and started recording. Typically, they were adaptations of Agatha Christie mysteries that went into public domain. But I approached them because they were in my listening area at the time. They knew who I was, and one of their players was actually a midday host at WNIJ. And so a meeting was set up. And 3 weeks later, I heard from the resident playwright at Artists Ensemble Theater, Margaret Rather, and she showed me the script that she did for this. And it was fantastic.
Wow.
She had to make a little change at the end to make this adaptation make sense, and I agreed. And the contract involved no money at all. I just wanted them to do this, and they were looking for something interesting to do. So the Saturday before Labor Day in 2021, 7 union actors walked into a studio to record these parts, and it's available on Spotify, Podbean, wherever you get podcasts. It's the Fiona's Guardians episode of Mysterious Journey. And I'm biased, but I think it is outstanding.
Well, you know, I'm sure you have whet the appetite of some people to hear that. So I want to make sure if I don't have the link to that in the material you sent me, Dan, would you please send me that link?
I will.
I will include it in the show notes, listeners, so that you can go there immediately after you finish this podcast if you want. Click on the link and listen to this because I know that you would thoroughly enjoy that as I will. So I can tell you already that I'm probably going to go listen to that, Dan.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
So I would like to hear it. So this book has been out. So how long has this book been out?
The paperback came out in 2020, and then the hardback version, my publisher released the hardback version in October of 2022. Um, and I'll be working with this publisher again for the sequel.
Okay.
Burton Mayer's Books. Burton Mayer's Books is located in Scotland.
Wow.
Mhm.
And we will make sure that you get links to the book as well, listener, and so that you can find this. I assume it's available on multiple sites, including Amazon Books, I would think.
Yeah, it is, but I would encourage someone who's actually thinking about buying this book, Fiona's Guardians, if they have a mom and pop independent bookshop in their neighborhood or in their town, you can order it from them. They will. It might take just a few days, but you'll be supporting your own local business. I encourage you. I've actually been co-branding with independent bookstores for several years now, and yes, I maintain an Amazon page, but I think that local independent bookstores are also more likely to invite local authors to do readings and to stock their books, and so I think that they are very worth very much worth supporting.
Yeah, I would agree with that 110%. I've had some wonderful independent bookstores over my career that have allowed me to have books on their shelf, which is not always the case if you go into a Barnes and Noble or such. And then, like you said, to invite you in to do readings and things like that, which to me is just one of the greatest pleasures to go in and
Mhm.
share what you have poured your heart and soul into, especially when people seem to appreciate that. So,
Yes.
and I know that my listeners have appreciated this conversation, Dan, the passion that you have for this book, for Fiona, for
Yeah.
uh, for this story. So, in addition to writing the sequel to this, which you've been working on, and again, listener, it's supposed to come out hopefully around October of 2024. You're also, I think, writing a nonfiction book that you are about to release very soon as well. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Because I am very hopeful that we have authors that are listening to this podcast or authors to be. And so I would like for them to hear this because I know a little bit about where we're going with this. So
Okay.
please
Yeah.
do share, Dan, that information.
Okay. At the end of February, I'm going to release my first nonfiction book. It's called DIY Book Promo: How to Find Readers Without Spending Money. Keith, I'm sure you have talked to many authors about the same thing. I hear from so many people who struggle with how to promote themselves. Many people who write, they're introverts and they don't like going out there and
Right.
having to tell their story. But it's a necessary part of the business. I think we'll
It
all
really
agree.
is.
Um,
Yes, it
and
is.
and those who then try to market their books. There's so much information out there. Some of it's very confusing. Quite often, you're being led to purchase some sort of a service, which is fine. Everybody has a right to make a buck, but I often have wondered, how can you point to the company that you hired or the person you hired as a publicist? How can you point to that person as increasing sales? And so I would much rather, do the work myself. And frankly, come on, Keith, we're authors. We're supposed
Right.
to be poor, right?
You're
Who
trying
has the money
if
to
you're
hire a publicist?
yeah, yeah, if you're trying to make a living of this, unless you're a very select few, yes, the answer to that is yes, you're poor.
So, and of course, many writers have complained that they were solicited by scammers or even
Yes,
fell for a scam. And
happens
goodness
every
gracious,
day.
I want to avoid that as well for my fellow writers. So I have borrowed from the 3-year campaign from Fiona's Guardians all the lessons, all the tools and tricks that I learned, and I did a lot of stuff that was unusual to get my book out there. So I share everything,
Hmm.
and I also draw on my 30 years in radio to teach readers how to pitch for a media interview, how to perform well in front of the microphone, and then how to share that interview when it comes out. Uh, and also, duh, to how to recognize the importance of getting in front of a microphone to talk about your book. A lot of people still haven't gotten that yet. So much of my advice involves that. However, the tools and tricks I learned during my own marketing campaign are varied, and I've had some successes. The adaptation that we just talked about from Artists Ensemble Theater is one of
Mhm.
them.
Mhm. Any of those little clever nuances of ways of getting that material out there is certainly going to, but it's just like social media. We all know how inundated it is. And a
Mhm.
lot of people go like, well, I can't stand out. I just feel like just an insignificant fish in a major pond. And truthfully, in some ways you are. But one of the things we have to do is to be unique in ourselves and put ourselves out there. And you are not only as if you're an author, you're not only just selling your work, you're selling yourself.
Right.
And that's that's something that a lot of authors have trouble with because they are creative minds, but yet sometimes strategically they're a little less, um, shall we say, a personality, getting the
Mhm.
job done systematically when it comes to this promotion. So yes, I appreciate what you said, Dan, because it is as important as writing the book if you want anybody to read it. I mean, if you
Exactly.
just want to write it for your own pleasure or for your mother, or make everybody in your immediate family buy one, okay, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that. Every right. But if you want the general public to get it, they've got to know about it. So I really appreciate this, and it's really great that you're sharing the tools and techniques that you did, the ones that you learned, and I think that's going to be very helpful, I think.
I'm hoping it will be. I've already gotten invited to speak at some conventions and book festivals. So the Imaginarium convention in Louisville in July, I will be speaking on DIY book promo about that. Also at the Louisville Book Festival and for the Rockford Writers Guild and some others. So if you can't come to one of the festivals or events, I do speak to writers groups via Zoom. And so I'd be willing to speak to your group and tell you everything I know.
I might need to invite you back on a special episode of the podcast just to do some of this and help us with this. Um, are any of your? I know that the Fiona, the vampire series, as well as this book, are either or are both also available in digital format or only print format?
Both. So yes, Fiona's Guardians is available in hardback, paperback, and Kindle, and the DIY book promo will be available as an ebook and paperback when it comes out next month.
Very good, very good. And dear friends, we will put all of this information in the show notes and just make sure that you have every way. And I'm going to remind Dan to please send me the link to the podcast episode you mentioned in
Yep.
this podcast, because I would love for our listeners to be able to listen, because obviously they're podcast listeners. They wouldn't be listening to this. So we want to make sure they have a chance to listen to that as well. Dan, is there anything else that you want to share with the viewer slash listener here on the podcast that you want them to know?
Well, every year I try to get it booked into as many, scheduled into as many bookstores as possible for events. So it's possible you'll see me at your own local family-owned bookstore one day. And please say hi when you see me. And Keith, I've just really enjoyed talking with you. I appreciate the invitation, and I look forward to seeing you as well at one of these book festivals or conventions.
I sure hope you will, Dan. Thank you very much for being on here. Dan Klefstad.
Klefstad,
Hopefully,
yeah.
okay. I have to admit the name I just have to be careful with, and that is Fiona's Guardian. Is that right?
Fiona's
All right.
Guardians, plural.
Oh,
She does have many of them. So
that's
here's the
right.
hardback cover. I
All
should
right.
mention the cover art is by a Ukrainian artist my publisher hired, Martelia, and I thought she knocked it out of the park with this sort of gothic,
It's
but
beautiful.
also noir cover. So Fiona's Guardians.
All right. Well, check it out, my dear listener. Dan, thank you again for listening. I
Thank
really
you.
do appreciate it. And I will be getting this uploaded and it will be available to our listening audiences very soon. Folks, I really do appreciate you taking the time to listen to this podcast. We do try to get some fantastic authors on here just to share a little bit about their heart, their vision, about what they're trying to do, and the words they're trying to put out to the world. So we want you to support authors, buy their books, read their books, talk about their books. We need you to help us spread the word and keep reading and books an important part of our lives. So until next time, make it a great day. Thank you for listening to Book Talks with Keith. We'll see you really soon.